The relationship with Mara was the best thing that had happened to me in years, and I spent 8 months methodically destroying it without understanding what I was doing or why. That is the sentence I have spent a long time learning to say plainly. It took years to get there, years in which I told a different version, one where the problems were shared, where we had simply been incompatible, where the ending was a kind of mutual gravity rather than something I manufactured alone. The shared incompatibility story was easier to carry. It distributed the weight. But it wasn't accurate. Mara was warm in a way I hadn't encountered before. Not performatively warm, not the kind of warmth that announces itself and then disappoints on closer inspection. She was consistently, quietly attentive in ways that asked nothing back from me. She remembered what I'd mentioned offhandedly 3 weeks earlier. She noticed when I was tired before I'd said so. She made space for me in her life without making a display of it. I knew, even at the time, that this was not ordinary. I knew I was in the presence of something rare. And I waited, with a patience I didn't recognize as waiting, for the real version of her to arrive. The version that would confirm what I already knew, somewhere beneath the knowing, that I didn't deserve this. That the warmth had conditions I hadn't yet discovered. That I would eventually find the ceiling and learn what I was actually worth to her. She didn't have a ceiling. That was the problem. When there was no evidence of limits, I began creating situations that would surface them. Not consciously, I want to be precise about this, because the conscious version would have been a different kind of failure, more straightforward and correctable. What I was doing was not intentional in any way I could have narrated at the time. I was operating from something older and more automatic than intention. I was creating the familiar terrain. The familiar terrain for me, the emotional landscape I had grown up in, was one of uncertainty and conditional regard. You were loved when you performed correctly. When you fell short, the temperature dropped. When you asked for too much, you learned what too much meant by having it denied. This wasn't cruelty. It was just the architecture of how care had been expressed in my family. The love was real. It was also contingent. And I had spent so many years inside that contingency that I had come to experience it as the natural shape of love itself. Mara's love didn't have that shape. It was too even. Too reliable. I couldn't find the conditions, and without conditions I had no map. I didn't know what I was worth to her because I had no reference point for worth that wasn't tied to performance. And so the security that she offered, which was genuine, which was exactly what I would have said I wanted, became, in some part of my nervous system, evidence of something wrong. I started being difficult. That's the plain word for it. I picked arguments on nights when things were good. I accused her of things she hadn't done because the emotions I was looking for, the withdrawal, the anger, the cooling, weren't materializing on their own, and I needed them. Not because I wanted to be punished. Because the absence of punishment felt more threatening than the punishment itself. At least when there was distance, I knew what I was dealing with. At least when she was hurt, I could feel like I understood the rules. She stayed through more of this than she should have. That is another sentence I had to learn to say without softening. She stayed because she was committed and because she understood, even before I did, that there was something I was working out that had nothing to do with her. She said this to me once, quietly, in the kitchen after an argument that had started over something I cannot even reconstruct. She said, "I don't think you're angry at me. I think you're waiting for me to hurt you, and you're trying to speed that up." I denied it with a conviction that was total and false. I was furious at the suggestion. The fury itself was information I didn't know how to read. We ended 3 months after that conversation. The ending was my doing, though I arranged it so that the final act was hers. I created conditions bad enough that she finally, and correctly, decided to leave. I walked away from it feeling the particular dull vindication of someone who has proved themselves right about something they wished they were wrong about. There. See? It ended. It was always going to end. The thing I was afraid of happened, and I made it happen, and that feels like both a relief and a confirmation. The relief, I later understood, was the removal of hope. Hope had been the dangerous part. As long as the relationship was intact, I was vulnerable to it actually working, which meant I was vulnerable to receiving something I believed, at the deepest architectural level, that I did not merit. The ending closed that vulnerability. I was safe again, in the way that only people who have confused safety with smallness can understand. What I could not see then, what took several more years and a good therapist and the specific discomfort of watching myself begin to replicate the same pattern with someone new, was that I had spent 8 months solving a problem I had brought into the relationship with me. Mara had not given me a reason to feel undeserving. I had imported that from somewhere else entirely. From years of learning that conditional love was what love looked like, that earning was what belonging required, that when something felt too easy it was probably because I was missing something about the cost. There is a particular grief in understanding this, and it is not like other griefs. It is not grief for what was lost, exactly. It is grief for what was unnecessary. Mara was not a lesson I had to take the hard way. She was a door that was already open. I built the wall myself, brick by brick, over 8 months, with a kind of blind industry that I mistook for self-protection, and that was, in fact, self-impoverishment. The question I eventually had to answer, the one that actually changed something, was not what did I do wrong but rather what was the wrongness doing for me? What was the destruction providing? And the honest answer was, it was providing the familiar. It was rendering the world legible. A love with conditions is at least a love with a map. A love without conditions requires you to believe something about yourself that you have no evidence to support. And when you have spent long enough without that evidence, the absence of conditions doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like standing on a surface you can't trust with your weight. Learning to let the surface hold me, learning to inhabit a relationship as though I had a right to be in it, that has been the actual work. Not learning to be less destructive. Learning to believe, slowly and against considerable internal resistance, that there was something worth holding steady for. That I was worth holding steady for. I don't know where Mara is now. I hope she found someone who showed up for what she was offering, who didn't spend 8 months testing whether her warmth had limits. I hope she didn't have to work as hard to rebuild the belief that she was worth staying for. I think she didn't. I think she knew that clearly, and it was me who had the problem. The clarity took me much longer. But I got there. Here is what I carry forward from this, and what I hope might be useful if you recognize any part of your own story in mine. The pattern I described does not operate because we are careless or unintelligent or unaware. It operates because it has a function, because it is doing something for us that we have not found another way to do. Staying in the wrong situation, staying silent when we should speak, not walking away when the door is right there, all of these behaviors persist because they are solving something, even if imperfectly. They are providing some version of comfort or protection or identity that we have not yet found a better way to provide. Understanding that function is the first move. Not judging the behavior, but asking honestly, what is this doing for me? What would I have to give up if I stopped? What am I afraid will happen if I make the change I know I need to make? Those questions do not dissolve the pattern automatically. But they make it visible in a new way. And visibility changes the relationship to the thing. When you can see what something is doing, you can start to choose whether you want it to keep doing it. The change that followed was not easier because I understood the mechanism. It was the same difficulty. But I went into it knowing what I was moving through rather than being entirely inside it without perspective. That perspective is what I want to pass on here. Not the specific story. The structure. The shape of how we stay in things longer than we should, how we look away from things we can see, how we tell ourselves the thing will change without giving it a mechanism for changing. You are not alone in this. It is not a character flaw. It is how the human nervous system manages uncertainty and fear. But you can do something different. The doing starts with the looking. Look at it. Directly. Honestly. Without the story that makes it easier to carry. And then decide what you want to do with what you see. That decision, fully conscious and fully yours, is the only kind that actually changes anything. There is also something I want to say about the specific moment of turning toward rather than away, the moment when you actually do the thing you have been not doing. Because that moment has a texture that I was not prepared for, and that I think is worth naming so you know what to expect when you reach it. It does not feel like relief. Not at first. The moment of change, of finally having the conversation, or walking away, or saying the thing, or making the decision, often feels worse before it feels better. There is a period of acute discomfort in which the old equilibrium has been disturbed but the new one has not yet settled. You have stopped managing the avoidance, which means the thing you were avoiding is now fully present, no longer softened by distance. That period is real and it is temporary. I want to say both of those things with equal emphasis. It is real, do not be surprised by it, do not mistake it for evidence that you made the wrong choice. And it is temporary, it has a duration, and that duration is almost always shorter than the years of management that preceded it. The other side of that period is different. Not perfect, change does not produce perfection. But different in the specific way of someone who has stopped spending energy on maintaining something and can now spend that energy somewhere else. The ambient cost disappears. The weight that you had normalized as simply the weight of life turns out to have been specific and removable. I have felt that release more than once. Each time it is instructive about how much I had been carrying that I didn't know I was carrying. You probably know what you're carrying. You just haven't decided to put it down yet. When you decide, it will be hard first and better after. That is almost always the order of things. And the better, when it arrives, is real. What I notice now, in the life I have after the story I told here, is a kind of attentiveness I didn't have before. Not anxiety, that's different. Anxiety is looking for the thing that might go wrong. What I have is more like a quiet, ongoing check-in. Am I here because I want to be? Am I saying what I actually think? Am I moving toward what matters or managing around something I haven't named? These questions don't produce constant disruption. Most of the time the answer is, yes, I am where I want to be, saying what I think, moving in the right direction. The check-in confirms what I thought. And that confirmation is itself valuable. It builds a different relationship with my own choices. They feel more like choices and less like things happening to me. On the occasions when the answer is different, when the check-in reveals an avoidance or a suppression or a staying too long, I try to act on the information faster than I used to. Not immediately, not impulsively. But without the elaborate deferral structure. Without the "I'll address this when the conditions are better." The conditions will not be better. They will be different. Different is workable. Better is a fiction. I am the only condition that changes. And I change through the practice of looking and then acting on what I see. That's the whole thing. The looking and the acting. Over and over. For as long as it takes. Which is your whole life. But a whole life spent actually inside it is worth more than a whole life spent at the edge of it, managing the view. I know which one I want. I think you do too.